Blessings, everyone, and welcome back to another podcast. I'm Yvonne Perry, and I'm your host today. My guest today is Jeff Krisman, and he and I have had a conversation a couple weeks back and really enjoyed our time that we spent together, so I decided to have him on my show. Jeff, welcome to We Are One in Spirit podcast.
Yvonne, thank you so much. This is such an honor and a pleasure to be here with you. Thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome. It's an honor to have you here. Well, my guests are probably not familiar with you and what you do. Why don't you share a little bit to introduce yourself?
Sure, absolutely. And I guess the probably the most concise way I would put this is as someone who's been on the spiritual path in some way or another for about the last 30 years. And the way that I actually had an opportunity to meet you is I actually have a couple of different podcasts. The one is called ONEConsciousness Deep Conversations podcast. And that is a podcast I've had for about a little over 3 years. And where this is one where I actually interview spiritual practitioners, teachers, healers, and really go, kind of go deep into being able to hear about their journey and their work and their transformation. The beautiful part is I never know how these conversations are going to go. I really allow myself to not have any preconceived notions or any expectations or agenda other than a few basic questions. And then the other podcast that I do is called the Inspiring Conversations podcast. And that's actually the one that's been going for a little over 4 years.
Wow.
And that's actually how I got my start doing the podcast. And it's mostly talking with artists of various kinds, different kinds of visual artists, musicians, writers, and things like that. So kind of have really, really kind of living in two different, well, I'd say two different worlds, but I guess it really is all one world when it comes right down to it.
Yeah, it is. So it sounds like you maybe have a background in what, entertainment, podcasting, or recording, or
Well, I appreciate it. As strange as this sounds, I actually don't. In fact, to tell you the truth, I don't have any background or training or experience at all. I appreciate you saying that. I have had a few people over the years say to me that people have asked me if I'm some kind of broadcaster and say that I have a radio voice, which is I've always found rather interesting. Kind of a funny, I guess I should say, maybe it's funny, it may not be, but kind of an interesting side note is that I one time believed that enough that I went to a local production company and I actually auditioned to do some voiceover work for radio stations. And the manager there told me that I sounded like I was reading things too much, and so it didn't really come off as natural and spontaneous. But that's about the closest I've ever gotten to ever having an actual radio career of some sort. Yeah.
well, at least they didn't fault you for your beautiful Southern accent.
I appreciate that. I appreciate it.
Were you born and raised in the South?
Yes, I actually was. In fact, I'm actually born and raised in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and
Okay.
I've actually lived here for just about all my life. I've actually, and I've also lived in Oklahoma City for a few years, but
Mm-hmm.
mostly here in Tulsa. I've been away just a couple of times, and what I find is that as a young man, I thought it really would be interesting to go to the big city and really go someplace that was much bigger, which was still, I guess Dallas, Texas would still be in the South. So that's about my only other experience away from here, but definitely glad to be here. At some point, I just realized this is where I belong, and
Mm-hmm.
this is where I've been led to stay, and so I'm just staying here and making the most of it.
I love being in the South. I love our milder winters. I did time in Indiana for about 2 years.
Oh
I
wow, they get
quit
some
doing
they get some
time
winters there, don't they?
because I felt like I was shut in on lockdown. It's like I practiced lockdown in the 90s.
Oh yeah.
It's good for us to have the freedom to move around again, at least here in the
Oh
South.
yeah,
Tennessee's pretty
absolutely.
much open now, so I'm thankful for that.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so tell me a little bit about your spiritual journey and what interested you in interviewing people who are on a spiritual path.
I really appreciate you asking that. And what's really interesting is that I started out. Well, I shouldn't say it's interesting. It may or may not be. For some reason, I'm saying that. I don't know why, but I was going to mention that in terms of my upbringing, I didn't really have what you would call an overly spiritual upbringing. There was some involvement with religion, and I did have some exposure to that, but I really didn't necessarily I heard people talk about having a connection with spirit, but I didn't really necessarily I don't think I experienced that for myself. And so I went kind of on a different path as a late in my teenage years. I became more familiar with Eastern thought and philosophy, and studied
Okay.
over the years, studied Buddhism and Hinduism. And it's, what's really interesting, I guess what I would say is that, going a different direction and really looking at other cultures and approaching it from that way, I think it really allowed me to, what I didn't realize at the time was that I was beginning to really form a relationship with spirit, and beginning to actually tune in and get in touch with those things. And I didn't realize that till many, many years later. And so what I was going to say is that as far as interviewing folks, I found that because I really got to a place in my life where I felt very isolated and struggled a lot with chronic depression over most of my life. About 4 years ago, I had moved to a different city and just found myself in a place where I didn't really know anyone. And I'd always been a huge podcast fan. And I thought to myself one day, I knew I had to do something to get off the couch, so to speak, and start living life and make, at the time, I thought this might be a good way to make friends and just, put myself in a position, kind of get out of my comfort zone and have conversations with people. And of course, not having any training and not knowing what to do other than I'd listened to podcasts, and I thought that maybe I could try this and see what happened. I was very nervous and very scared about it. And so I started reaching out to visual artists in my area. And at that time, what I did was I would go to an art gallery and just sit down and talk to people and just record an audio interview and just and be there with people, face to face, so to speak. Yeah.
Wow, that's really interesting. I don't know of very many people that do that kind of in-person one-to-one with artists, and then taking that to the digital world. Yeah, that's beautiful.
Yeah, and that's really how I did this for the first 3 years. I only really started doing these Zoom interviews, and at the time, it didn't even occur to me until a few months into this, when after COVID started, that I could interview people out of my local area. So for the
Right.
most part, most of those years were really spent just talking to people locally. And then I got involved. There is a national, I guess it's a nationally syndicated magazine that basically they operate in different local areas. And so this is a place where there's all kinds of opportunities for people to learn about holistic healing professionals and teachers and events. And so I got actually involved with this particular magazine. And so I started going out with them. And what I did was I would interview their advertising clients. And this was kind of a value added service for this magazine.
Wow.
And I got a chance to start meeting different healers and, different practitioners. And I was scared to death. I really felt like I was I felt, at least with art, I felt like, because I'd always been an art fan, that I at least had a little bit of some sense of what to talk about. But for some reason, I don't know why that was, but initially, even though I had been on the path for many years, there was a lot of nervousness around that. And I didn't even realize that there was something that was kind of taking shape in terms of the way that I had these conversations. And when I listened back to some of those, I was talking very quickly. I was very, very nervous. And it probably took me a couple of years to really begin to have this kind of approach where I would just reach out to people and really let them know this is just an opportunity to have a spontaneous, just a kind of an in the moment conversation. Right. And I think really for me, it's been a spiritual practice of sorts and about 3 years in, I was actually interviewing a healer, and we were talking face to face, and her eyes got like big as $50. And she looked at me and she said, "Don't you understand? This is your spiritual practice." And I was kind of bowled over, and she was really serious about it. And that's what really woke me up. And then I realized, oh, okay, this is what this is about. Yeah.
I think our spiritual path and calling is born into us, and then we have to put our feelers out there and find out what it is that we like to do, what really jives with us. In my latest book on celestial shamanism, I gave a background about how I started with this, and this morphed into this, and then I followed this breadcrumb and it led me here. And that's just the way it is with you. You just kind of did whatever felt like you wanted to do at the time. And the next thing you know, it's like you found your spiritual path.
Wow, I love that. I'm so glad you said that. And I will admit freely, as hard as this is, but I do want to be, completely candid about this, that I know before that there were some years where I really thought I knew what I was doing. In other words, I thought I knew what my path was, and I really thought I knew what my practice was. And so there's a lot of assumptions being made. And then, but I love what you were saying. At some point, I had the opportunity to surrender all that in terms of that identity and any ego that was wrapped up around being someone doing anything at all.
Yeah.
And so that's what I love, what you're just talking about, the breadcrumbs that, you know, and unfortunately, I guess that it's one of those things that sometimes maybe that's what it takes is, you know, having that idea of thinking I knew who I was, but at least I was still out there following the breadcrumbs. And I love how you mentioned that, because that's,
Well, you
to
know,
me, that's really what it is what it's all about.
Earth life is about exploring and finding out who God is in us and how God wants to express that through our physical personality, our physical body, our gifts and talents, the things we like to do. And I think too many times people think they have to hang a sign out and say, I'm a healer, come over here and let me heal you. Instead, it's just the day to day grocery store, driving in traffic, walking the dog kind of life that is our spiritual practice. I don't see the
Yeah.
separation anymore. My religion taught me to see things very black and white, no gray. This is spiritual, this is not. I don't live like
Oh,
that
yeah.
anymore.
Yeah.
It's all spiritual. It's all spiritual because I see God in everything and everybody. And when you look at life like that, I think it's much easier on you to just discover what it is you like to do and give yourself permission to just do it.
Oh, absolutely. And what's, in fact, I had a teacher from years ago that used a phrase, and I don't think I understood it at the time, but he was talking about how this path really is very, what he called extraordinarily ordinary. And at the time I didn't really get it. And I feel like a lot of what you're speaking of, it's bringing that back for me, that I'm realizing that a lot of this is about just where and how I find myself in every moment,
Right.
without me trying to consent. And I know with all the, you know, there's all the books out there, and there's all the various courses, and that's all wonderful. Those are all very wonderful things. But I think when I got to a place where I had to conceptualize everything, I couldn't have a spiritual experience unless I thought I conceptualized it in some way and was kind of narrating and telling myself what was happening, so to speak.
I think that's
Yeah.
what all religion is trying to do, is to help connect us with source, help us to have a relationship with our creator. But sometimes all the rules and the do's and don'ts, and here's what you can do if you want to be accepted, and here's what you want to do if you want to be kicked out the back door. And I got kicked out the back door a few times, and that's all right, because it was part of the path. It was just part of
Yeah.
me discovering, well, that's not working. And I think a lot of that, and my determination to just really have that relationship, that strong intimacy with source, is what caused me to see, well, maybe religion's not what I need. But I love the teachings and the life of Christ, and the way that, he talk about extraordinary ordinary.
Yeah. Yeah.
He worked with fishermen, he worked with tax collectors, he worked with people that were just of ill repute. He loved the sinners, the publican, all of them. And
Yeah. Yeah.
wherever he went, there was a ministry. He didn't hang out
Love that.
his workshop sign and say, come on in and have your wooden shoes made here, and I'll teach you how to do it. He didn't take any of those courses. He had that fellowship with the divine. To me, that's the most important thing that religion can teach us, or on our roundabout path, we learn it ourselves. What is it we really want? That intimacy with the Father, the God, the Christ, the Mother, the divine, whatever. Lots of names we can tag on to that. But when you found that, it's like nothing else really has to be conceptualized. It doesn't have to be compartmentalized. It doesn't have to be called sacred or secular. It just is part of the daily practice of being who you are.
Oh, I absolutely love that. I really do. That really speaks to me. I appreciate that.
Mm,
Yeah.
yeah. So what's next on your agenda? Do you have more podcast guests lined up, or?
Yeah, I really appreciate that. Yeah, I generally try to, do, I'd say on average, a couple of these a week.
Mm,
And sometimes it ends up being 3 or 4 a week.
oh,
And there's
goodness.
sometimes I get a little carried away and have to kind of dial it back just a little bit, because I think that's just one of those stages that I went through with this whole thing, is that at some point, once I got more comfortable with it, then I got into the stage of starting to think, hey, I can actually do this. And then there was kind of an opportunity there to kind of maybe be a little bit, I don't want to say self-indulgent, but there was, when I started feeling really confident, then it was going through that period where I was a little bit enamored with myself, so to speak, and thinking that it was going to get easier, until I finally found out one day and sort of had that wake up call that it's not always going to get easier. It's going to, every time I sit down with someone, it's going to feel different.
Mm-hmm.
And some days I feel like I'm in the zone, some days not so
Right.
much.
I get
And
that. Yeah.
yeah, and I was going to say that I find that it's the days where I'm not, where I think that's really about the trust, isn't it? And the surrender.
It
And
is.
even if I don't know that I can show up, I think it really is just about showing up, isn't it? No
Mm-hmm.
matter no matter how I feel, or whether I think I can do this or not on any
Absolutely.
given day.
It is. And um, there are just some times when, you're having a bad day and you're just not feeling as good. And you go in and you have that podcast interview, or you have that client, or something that you do to serve others. It cheers you up and you feel better. It's
Oh
like,
yeah.
I didn't want to do it, but I did it anyway because it was the right thing to do. And once I started, it's like the ego finally gave in, you know, and then it became fun. But yeah,
Yeah.
there's
Yeah.
that old ego, it don't want to do stuff that it's supposed to do. So you have to crack the whip sometimes.
And I was going
Yeah.
to tell you, that's one of the things that really surprised me, is that at some point it felt like it was getting easier until it didn't anymore. And then I can also say to you that there was those times where maybe things really weren't clicking. And then I went through all of the gyrations about, well, maybe I can't do this anymore. And suddenly all the self-talk got really very negative,
Mm,
and it just really wasn't very, it wasn't very self-nurturing. And so I definitely went through those periods as well, where there was times where I thought, I just don't think I've got this anymore. I don't think I can do this anymore.
well, what
And I'm
brought
so
you
grateful
out of
that I
that?
didn't give into that. Yeah.
Yeah, what brought you out of that? I mean, you didn't give in to it, obviously.
Yeah, thank you. I was going to say, and as someone who has, from a psychological standpoint, has been prone to depression at times. I mean, I definitely, over the last couple of years, just as I found more light in my life, and I feel like it really deepened the connection to source. What I find now is, even though I maybe feel that tendency, I can feel those self-defeating thoughts starting to come around,
Mm-hmm.
that somehow it's like I just can't really give into that or indulge in that anymore. And I think, I'm wondering too, maybe is it possible that those thoughts, that I can't separate and say those thoughts aren't sacred either? I'm beginning to wonder, is it possible that those thoughts are just part of this whole experience,
Well,
and part of this adventure of being human?
I can speak to that because when I have those negative thoughts, I say, "Oh, thank you for reminding me of what's not true. So now maybe I will speak what is true." And I find the antidote. So
Yeah.
even though it seems negative and detrimental, if I don't give in to it and I apply a positive statement that's contrary or the opposite of what this negative that's going on in my head, I find it is the counterpart. It's all sacred.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. Thank you. Yeah, and I appreciate that reminder, because it's interesting. I hadn't thought about these different stages, and I'm so glad that you've been asking about these things, just in terms of that journey in podcasting as well. And I think at some point I woke up and realized that this is sacred as well, these conversations,
Hmm.
and having these experiences with people, and just sitting
Absolutely.
down and realizing that I can't really, at some point it didn't even really matter. I think for a while there was this human aspect of, I wanted to have more skill at this. I wanted to get to where I could really be smooth,
Yeah, yeah.
and all the questions came off just perfectly. And I can tell you that I only let go of that maybe about a year ago, where I realized that the more I tried to, it's almost like trying to improve, I got to see that really wasn't really what this was about. I mean, I guess I can't say that self-improvement is bad or wrong, but it's just that at some point it just wasn't interesting anymore. I felt like there was something higher, or
Mm.
something that was deeper about this, than just trying to improve as a human being, and quote unquote do these interviews better.
Yeah.
Uh, and I was going to tell you, the other thing I thought that really changed things for me was, I was speaking with a practitioner. I guess that was been about almost 2 years ago. And after we finished, I used to refer to these as interviews. And she looked at me and she said, "You should start calling these conscious conversations."
Mm.
And that was another one of those. It just kind of bowled me over. And I thought, and it
Uh-huh.
wasn't so much about the name, but I think what I'm realizing is that was a sign for me that this is really, it's not just about
Yeah.
interviewing people and asking
Right.
questions, because I always kind of limited myself. And I can look back at many of these conversations. And anytime I would bring up anything that didn't sound like a interview or question, I would immediately apologize for it and almost kind of take it back. And now what I realize is I don't have to get so wrapped up even as my identity as the person doing the interview, so to
Yeah,
speak.
that's
Yeah.
right. That's right. And what did you feel like you learned from, I've dealt with depression, you've dealt with depression. And I remember the first time somebody gave me this quote, how these life-changing quotes come along. And they said, depression is nothing but self-pity turned inward. That made me mad. You don't understand
Yeah.
my depression. You don't understand how hard it is. My ego just came right up. It's like, it runs in my family. It's a brain chemical thing. And I realized, you know what? I'm entertaining all these negative thoughts and I'm giving them power. So maybe I am feeling sorry for myself and I'm using this as a tool to not have to take responsibility for changing myself.
Absolutely.
And then there's this
Absolutely.
flip side of that, like you were talking about, where you become so self-conscious of self-improvement and I got to do it better and I got to do it this way. It becomes self-defeating again.
Yeah.
Yeah, so where do
Yeah.
we find that balance between wanting to improve ourselves and not having to be perfect?
I love that. Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. And I was going to say that really has been so much of this because I feel like I really, in some way, I feel like I played all of these assumptions out. Then I got to a point where if I could do one a week, then I wanted to do two a week. And then if 2 a week wasn't enough. And then one day I woke up and I'm doing 5 of these a week. And that's when I realized, okay, maybe this isn't really, because again, it was that human nature of, more is better. So
Mm,
if I can do 2, then certainly I can do 4 of these. But what I found is that if that's all I was looking to do, if that was the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, and then that's what I realized at the end of a long week of doing 5 of these on Friday afternoon, I would just collapse.
ooh,
And then I started looking for, okay, where I thought I was supposed to feel really great.
yeah.
Where did I thought I've come to this different level, and I realized that none of that was true. That was all just what I was telling myself up here. And so it made me realize so many times, I think when people strive so hard, because you can't really be happy and fulfilled until you get to that end point and make whatever goal. And not to say that there's anything wrong with goals, but I think I had convinced myself that I really couldn't be happy and fulfilled until I got there. And then once I got there, there wasn't any there, so to speak.
Yeah, it's like
Yeah.
performance based rather than just being authentic. Like, I've got to make this goal, I've got to meet this, and it can become overwhelming and it's not fun. Anytime you have to diet or you have to exercise, ugh. But if you can change your attitude about it and saying, I get to take a walk, I have a healthy body, I'm thankful that I can move my body freely. If you'll approach it with gratitude, I think that's the key to finding the balance between anything. If you find that your podcast 5 times a week is too much, then love yourself enough to say, hey, I got to stop this, you know, go find something else to do.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, life is too short to be lived in self-deprivation or the sabotage of overly striving to be perfect. So the balance then, the middle ground, the gray area is enjoying the moment and
Oh,
flowing with
absolutely.
and sometimes you do have to tell the ego, just sit down and shut up, we're doing it anyway. But
Love that.
yeah, then there's other times when it's like you may have been so excited about what you were doing that you wanted to do another podcast and another podcast and another one. But then after a while, it's like, wait a minute, reality check. Is this self-defeating or is this really serving the purpose? If I've stopped enjoying it, it's no longer serving the purpose.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that too, because I was going to tell you that part of this too was I think I was chasing something. The
Mm,
idea is that, I thought somehow I was going to be happier and that I was going to feel, I envisioned these things for myself. The other thing I was going to say to you too is I think that, initially, uh, I thought that, I was kind of running on the excitement of these. In other words, there was always that, whenever you get in these conversations, and the fear and concern and the nervousness, at some point when you feel like when I was able to let myself just be in the moment
yeah.
with people, then there's all the excitement that happens. And then it's, after the conversation's over, then there's kind of like what do you call it? Like an afterburn, there's this excitement. But at some point I realized that I really couldn't use that to connect with source more deeply either. That whole idea of trying to, use excitement as a fuel to deepen my connection or to deepen my practice. And so at some point I had to give that up as well and surrender that, because that just kind of felt like that played itself out too.
Yeah. What do you feel like really does help us intimately connect with source? What is it, an activity, or is it something we do, or what is it for you?
Oh, I appreciate that. I was going to say, over the years, I feel like I have, quote unquote, tried so many different things, but I would say that really what it has come down to, for me at least, is just actually being here. And if I can just be here with people, and these conversations really do feel very sacred now, in other words, and even if I catch myself saying the wrong word, or if I would want to call it a mistake, or whatever it is, that doesn't even really matter so much anymore, that it's just about being with people. And I guess part of being human, or I shouldn't say I guess, I know part of being human is sometimes saying the wrong word, or something doesn't come out the way I had intended, and yet it's still okay because I'm still here with you, and just basically not so wrapped up in my own head telling myself what's going on in a conversation like this, that it's just I'm here. No matter what, no matter how I may be getting in my own way, that if I can just, give that up and be here, to me, that feels like the deepest connection to source I've ever had, is just to actually just kind of, take my mask off and just be here with you.
I agree. There's something very freeing about that, not having to perform or try to please somebody else, but just truly enjoying where you're at, who you are, and what you're doing.
Yeah. Yeah. I had a thought the other day, and it was just kind of a fleeting something that came through. I started thinking about when I was having, doing these podcast conversations, I was thinking about, what is it that I'm really doing? What is it that I'm really, it's just there again, it was just something that came through my mind. What is it that I'm doing? What does this really mean? And I found myself laughing suddenly and realizing I don't really have to answer that question. That really the only thing the best thing that I can do is just be here. But there's no way I can really answer any of those questions.
Right.
At some point, I think those questions just really fade away if I'm not giving them energy and time and really trying to answer them so much.
That's it. Yeah. And I find sometimes that just laughing out loud, laughing at or with myself, it doesn't really matter. We all make mistakes, and I find them humorous at times. Oh my goodness. Yeah. Jeff, how do we find you online? If are you ever looking for podcast guests, or do you have like more than you can handle?
Oh, no, I'm definitely, thank you so much for asking. No, I'm definitely open to that. In fact, from time to time, I would say that I would certainly love if it had, there again, I don't want to get wrapped up in expectations, but it would be, it would be lovely to hear from people if they would have an interest in being on the podcast and speaking about their journey. And, ultimately what I end up doing is what I think most people do anyway, is, you end up, and for me, it's just, I tend to just let myself be led. If I read about someone, I will just, get this sense that, and I never really know for sure. It's just that I get this sense that, well, this may be someone that would be good to reach out to. And so I'll do that. But most of the time is with most people I've talked to, that it's a matter of reaching out to people, and taking that initiative to, invite people and send them an email or reach out to them in some way. I've only had, my goodness, probably maybe 3 or 4 people the whole 4 years I've been doing this that have ever reached out to me and said, hey, I'd love to, have a conversation with you. So yeah. And every time it's happened, it's been wonderful, because I feel there again, like there's some reason, and I don't know what the reason is, but I always get the sense after those people come on the podcast, I'm thinking, okay, it's just, I can feel it. And I know that there's some reason I'm supposed to be speaking with them, and I don't even have to know, but it just, that getting that sense of knowing.
Well, I've got a lot of people that I think could benefit from sharing. And it's not like I have to interview them. A lot of people are intimidated by being interviewed. So I did a beautiful podcast this morning, and one of the ladies on the call, and I won't even tell you which one because you probably can't tell. She flowed with such grace and ease once we got started, but she'd never done an interview. She'd never done a podcast before. So
Wow.
she was a little uncomfortable with that, and going through all the things that we're talking about. Oh, will it be good enough? But once we started and we just started having this chat, she just flowed. And I'm like, you sure you've never done this before? Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'll admit to you, even today, it's so weird. I mean, I've only had someone interview me, probably 3 or 4 times during this whole process. And see, there again, it's really easy for me to get wrapped up in that. Well, I'm the guy that asks questions. So if I'm going to be the one that sits on this side of the table, there is always kind of a weird sense of nervousness. And even it wasn't so much today. In fact, I think this has been the least that I've ever experienced it. But I think just initially, once we first got started, I think there was a little bit of, and I don't know if that's maybe just the way our minds work, that, there's a pattern.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm used to being the one asking the questions and suddenly I'm the one answering them,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
it does kind of change things a little bit.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
does. Sure does. A new role for you. Yeah. Well, I
Yeah.
appreciate you putting on that other hat and coming on and sharing with us today.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm very appreciative. And I was going to say to you that really is what this has become about, is just being with people and just being open to, and I never really know necessarily what people are going to say. I don't know.
I
And
don't even know what
sometimes it's
I'm
so
going to
weird
say.
at the oh yeah. And at the end, I've had so many times where people have said that they didn't even have any idea, that they had not intended to share certain things at all. And somehow it just happens.
You just flow
And
with
so
it.
yeah,
Just flow with it. Yeah. Well, Jeff, I want you to send me a link to where people can find you and find
sure,
your
sure.
podcast. And I will put
Yeah.
that in the description box below so that they can just click and come right over and visit with you.
Certainly, certainly. I'll go ahead. In fact, I'll email that to you right now as soon as I hang up here, so to speak. I'll
Uh,
definitely get that over to you.
Sounds great. And thank you for being my guest. It's been an honor.
Absolutely. I've really enjoyed it, and I feel it's been an honor as well. Thanks, Yvonne. It's been great talking to you.
Yes, great, great indeed. Thank you.